The sun beat down mercilessly on the vast expanse of Wyoming territory, painting the grasslands in shades of burnt amber and dusty gold. The year was 1889, and the frontier still held that raw, untamed quality that drew men westward with dreams of fortune and freedom. Across the rolling plains, as far as the eye could see, cattle dotted the landscape like scattered seeds on fertile ground. The wind carried with it the scent of sage and dust, mingling with the distant lowing of livestock that formed the lifeblood of the Double Bar Ranch. From atop a weathered ridge, Samuel Hawthorne surveyed his domain with eyes that had grown weary despite his prosperity. At 43, he cut an imposing figure against the backdrop of endless sky, broad shoulders filling out a well-tailored vest, hands roughened by years of honest work despite his wealth, and a face weathered by sun and wind that spoke of a man who hadn't forgotten his humble beginnings. His dark hair, touched with premature silver at the temples, caught the late afternoon light as he removed his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. The Double Bar Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, a testament to Samuel's shrewd business sense and relentless work ethic. The main house stood like a fortress of prosperity, a two-story structure of sturdy timber and stone that rose from the plains like a monument to success. Its wraparound porch offered shade from the brutal summer sun, and the glass windows, shipped at great expense from Denver, caught the light like jewels set in rough wood. Yet, for all his material success, Samuel felt a hollowness that gnawed at him like hunger. As he rode his bay stallion back toward the ranch house, he could already hear the voices carrying on the wind. Not the honest talk of cowboys and ranch hands, but the honeyed tones of relatives and townspeople who seemed to multiply like rabbits whenever he appeared in town. "There goes Sam Hawthorne," he'd heard them whisper just last Sunday after church. "Worth more than half the county combined, they say. Lucky man to have struck it rich with that cattle drive to Chicago." Lucky. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. Luck had nothing to do with the countless nights he'd spent sleeping under the stars, guarding his herd from wolves and rustlers. Luck hadn't helped him survive the winter of '81, when half the ranchers in the territory lost everything to the blizzards. No, it was determination, intelligence, and an iron will that had built his empire. But to them, he was simply a walking bank vault, a means to an end. As his horse picked its way down the rocky trail, Samuel's thoughts turned to the letter he'd received that morning from his cousin Fletcher. The man hadn't written in 5 years, not since Samuel had been struggling to keep his first 100 head of cattle alive. Now, suddenly, Fletcher was planning a visit, full of family feeling and fond memories of their shared childhood. Samuel wasn't fooled. Word of his recent sale of 500 head at premium prices had obviously reached even Fletcher's ears in Missouri. The ranch house came into fuller view, and with it, a sight that made Samuel's cynical heart soften despite itself. On the front porch, her auburn hair glowing like copper in the slanted light, sat his wife Margaret. She was bent over her sewing, her delicate fingers working the needle with practiced ease. Even from a distance, he could see the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, a habit she'd had since the day they'd met 8 years ago. Margaret O'Brien had been the daughter of a struggling homesteader when Samuel first laid eyes on her at the 4th of July dance in Cheyenne. He'd been a rising rancher then, comfortable but not yet wealthy. She'd been serving lemonade to raise money for the church, her green eyes bright with laughter as she teased the young cowboys who tried to sweet-talk extra glasses from her. Samuel had been tongue-tied, this man who could negotiate with the toughest cattle buyers in Chicago, reduced to stammering by a slip of a girl in a patched calico dress. Their courtship had been swift by frontier standards, 6 months of Sunday visits, chaperoned walks, and stolen glances across the church aisle, when he'd finally asked for her hand. Her father had been eager to accept, seeing it as a step up for his daughter, but Margaret herself had hesitated. "I need to know you're marrying me for me, Samuel Hawthorne," she'd said, those green eyes serious. "Not because I'm young and might give you sons, not because my father owes you money for that bull he bought. For me," he'd promised her then, swore on his mother's grave that his feelings were true, and they had been. But now, as his fortune had grown tenfold in the years since their wedding, he wondered if she would have chosen him if she'd known what lay ahead. Would she have married him if he'd been the wealthy Samuel Hawthorne of today, courted by mothers with marriageable daughters from as far away as San Francisco? The thought had been plaguing him for months now, ever since the incident at the Cattleman's Ball in Denver. He'd overheard Mrs. Wellington, the banker's wife, talking to her circle of friends. "Poor Margaret Hawthorne," she'd said with false sympathy. "She certainly landed herself a fortune, didn't she? Though I suppose she pays for it by living out in that God-forsaken wilderness. Still, we all make our choices." The implication had been clear, that Margaret had married him for his money, just like everyone else who circled him like vultures. The rational part of his mind knew better. Margaret had married him when his fortune was modest, when the ranch house had been a simple 3-room affair, when she'd had to help with the calving and make do with store-bought fabric for her dresses. But doubt, once planted, grew like tumbleweeds in his mind. "Samuel!" Margaret's voice carried across the yard as she spotted him approaching. She rose from her chair, smoothing down her skirts, a simple blue cotton affair that she'd made herself, despite his insistence that she order from the finest dressmakers in Denver. That was Margaret, always practical, never ostentatious. He dismounted at the hitching post, and their ranch hand, young Tom Bradley, appeared to take the reins. "Evening, Mr. Hawthorne," the boy said with a respectful nod. "Shall I give Zeus here a good rub-down?" "That would be appreciated. Tom." Samuel handed over the reins, noting how the boy handled the valuable stallion with careful reverence. Everyone treated his possessions like gold these days, afraid of damaging something and facing his wrath. Only Margaret still treated him like the man he'd been before the money. "You're late for supper," she said as he climbed the porch steps, but her tone was teasing rather than scolding. "Maria's kept it warm, but you know how she feels about her beef stew going dry. Had to check the far pastures," he said, accepting the kiss she placed on his weathered cheek. "Thought I saw signs of wolves out by Skeleton Ridge." Her face creased with concern, genuine concern for the danger, not for the potential loss of valuable livestock. "You didn't go alone, did you? Samuel, we've talked about this. The hands can't do everything," he finished for her. "I know. But sometimes a man needs to ride alone with his thoughts." She studied him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "What's troubling you? Is it Fletcher's letter?" He shouldn't have been surprised that she knew. Margaret had a way of reading his moods like most people read books. "Among other things," he admitted, following her into the cool interior of the house. The inside of the ranch house reflected Margaret's touch everywhere, not in ostentation, but in comfort. Handmade quilts covered the furniture. Wildflowers filled mason jars on every surface, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the kitchen. She'd resisted his every attempt to hire more help beyond Maria, the Mexican cook who'd been with him since his bachelor days, insisting she enjoyed keeping house over dinner. Margaret chatted about the day's small events, a hawk that had spooked the chickens, the progress of her vegetable garden, a letter from her sister in Nebraska. Samuel found himself only half listening, his mind churning with a plan that had been forming all day like storm clouds on the horizon. "Samuel," Margaret's voice cut through his reverie. "You haven't heard a word I've said about the church social, have you?" He had the grace to look guilty. "I'm sorry. Darling, my mind was elsewhere." "I can see that." She set down her fork and fixed him with a direct gaze. "What is it? And don't tell me it's nothing. I've been married to you for 8 years. Samuel Hawthorne, I know when something's eating at you." He pushed his plate away, no longer hungry. How could he tell her about the doubts that plagued him? How could he admit that he wondered if everyone in his life, perhaps even her, saw him as nothing more than a means to wealth? "Margaret," he began slowly, "do you ever regret marrying me?" Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one." "Do you ever think about how different your life might have been if you'd married, say, That schoolteacher from Laramie who was sweet on you? Robert Morrison? She laughed, but there was concern in her eyes. Samuel. Robert Morrison had hands softer than mine and fainted at the sight of blood. Can you imagine him helping birth a calf? He could have given you a comfortable life in town. Regular hours, Sunday socials, no worry about drought or cattle prices. And no you, she said simply. Samuel, what's brought this on? He stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the darkening plains. In the distance, he could see the lights of the bunkhouse where his cowboys would be settling in for the evening, probably playing cards and telling tales. Simple men with simple pleasures. Who knew exactly where they stood with each other? I'm thinking of selling, he said suddenly, the lie coming to his lips as naturally as breath. The whole spread, lock, stock, and barrel. He heard her sharp intake of breath behind him. Selling? But why? Bad investments. He continued, warming to his theme. That mining venture in Colorado, the shipping partnership in San Francisco, they've all gone belly up. The drought last year hit harder than I let on. We're facing ruin. Margaret. When he turned to look at her, her face had gone pale, but her eyes were steady. How bad is it? We'll lose everything within 6 months, maybe sooner if the creditors get impatient. The words tasted like ashes, but he pressed on. You could go to your sister in Nebraska. I'm sure Charles would. I'll do no such thing. She stood, her small frame rigid with indignation. My place is with my husband, for better or worse. We'll face this together. Margaret, be practical. You don't understand what poverty really means, what it will be like when everyone knows we've lost everything. Don't I? Fire flashed in her eyes. I grew up with patches on my patches. Samuel Hawthorne. I know exactly what poverty means. What I don't understand is why you think I'd abandon you at the first sign of trouble. He felt a flicker of hope quickly smothered by cynicism. Of course she'd say that now. When it was still theoretical. Wait until the reality set in. The loss of status. The pitying looks. The closed doors that had once opened eagerly. We'll see, he said quietly. We'll see. That night, as Margaret slept beside him, her hand resting trustingly on his chest, Samuel stared at the ceiling and finalized his plan. Tomorrow, he would ride into town and start spreading the word of his financial troubles. He'd be subtle at first, a mention of difficulties here, a canceled order there. Within a week, the whole county would know that Samuel Hawthorne, the great cattle baron, was facing ruin. And then he would finally know the truth about everyone in his life, especially the woman whose soft breathing filled the darkness beside him. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but instead, he felt only a cold dread settling in his stomach like a stone, because deep in his heart, beneath all the cynicism and doubt, he feared what he might discover. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its lonely cry echoing across the vast emptiness of the plains. Samuel closed his eyes and tried not to think about how that sound might soon match the emptiness in his own life. He had set his course, and like a cattle drive heading for market, there was no turning back now. The news of Samuel Hawthorne's financial troubles spread through Cheyenne like wildfire in dry grass. Within a week of his carefully dropped hints at the bank and the general store, the entire county buzzed with speculation. Samuel played his part masterfully, allowing his shoulders to slump just a fraction when he walked down Main Street, ordering cheaper cuts of meat from the butcher, and politely declining invitations to poker games at the Cattlemen's Club. The first to arrive at the ranch was his cousin Fletcher, rolling up in a hired buggy with enough luggage for a month's stay. Samuel watched from the barn as the man climbed down, his city clothes already dusty from the journey. Fletcher had grown stout in the 5 years since they'd last met, his face red and prosperous under his derby hat. "Sam," Fletcher called out with false heartiness, spreading his arms wide as if expecting an embrace. "My dear cousin, why, you look well despite, that is to say—" He trailed off, apparently remembering that Samuel was supposed to be facing ruin. "Fletcher," Samuel nodded, not moving to return the gesture. He'd deliberately dressed in his oldest work clothes, a flannel shirt with carefully placed patches and trousers that had seen better days. "Didn't expect you so soon." "Well, when I heard about your difficulties, I simply had to come." Fletcher's small eyes darted around, taking in the still impressive ranch house, the well-maintained barns, the quality horses in the corral. Samuel could practically see him calculating values. Family must stick together in times of trouble. Margaret appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd taken to doing more of the household work herself since Samuel had let 2 of the house servants go, or rather, since he'd paid them to take a holiday while maintaining the pretense of dismissal. "Mr. Fletcher, welcome. I'll have Tom take your bags to the guest room." Cousin Margaret." Fletcher's smile was oily. "Still lovely as ever. Though I must say, I'm surprised to see you doing the work of servants." A flash of anger crossed Margaret's face, but she smoothed it away. "Honest work never hurt anyone. Fletcher, will you take coffee? If it's not too much trouble." Fletcher's tone suggested he thought it was exactly that. Over the next days, Fletcher made himself comfortable. Too comfortable. He commandeered Samuel's study to write urgent business letters, helped himself to the best whiskey, and complained about the simple meals Margaret prepared. All the while, he probed for details about Samuel's supposed losses. "But surely you set something aside?" Fletcher pressed one evening after dinner. "A man of your intelligence must have hidden away a nest egg, perhaps in a bank back east, or invested in your wife's name." Samuel shook his head morosely. "Lost it all in the Colorado silver mine collapse. Every penny." Fletcher's face fell, but he recovered quickly. Well, these things happen. Tell me, Sam, have you given thought to what you'll do with the land? I mean, when the creditors come calling." "Haven't wanted to think about it," Samuel mumbled into his glass. "Because I have connections in Chicago," Fletcher continued eagerly. "Men who might be interested in purchasing at a fair price. Family price, you understand. Enough to give you and Margaret a fresh start somewhere." "How generous," Margaret said dryly from her chair by the fireplace. She'd been unusually quiet lately, watching Fletcher with those sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Fletcher wasn't the only relative to suddenly remember family ties. Samuel's second cousin, Henrietta Parsons, arrived from Denver with her simpering daughter Violet in tow. Henrietta, a widow who'd made no secret of her hopes that Violet might catch a wealthy rancher, was visibly disappointed by the state of affairs. "Oh, Samuel." She sighed dramatically over tea, her black morning dress rustling with every movement. "How the mighty have fallen. And here I was, hoping, well, never mind what I was hoping. Though I must say, when poor Mr. Parsons passed, leaving me with barely enough to maintain appearances, I never dreamed you'd find yourself in similar straits." "Mama," Violet whispered, color rising in her pale cheeks. "What?" "I'm merely expressing sympathy for our dear cousin." Henrietta's eyes were already cataloging the furniture, the silver, the paintings. "Tell me, Margaret dear, will you be selling the household items separately? I might be interested in that charming sideboard, as a memento, you understand." Margaret's smile was rigid. "We haven't made any decisions about selling." Henrietta: "No, but surely you must face facts, a woman in your position." "Well, I suppose you could go into service. You seem suited to it." The insult was delivered with a sweet smile. Samuel watched his wife's hands clench in her lap, but her voice remained level. "I'm suited to standing by my husband, Henrietta, in whatever circumstances." The stream of visitors continued. Business associates who'd once fawned over him now treated him with barely concealed contempt. Jake Morrison from the Mercantile suggested, none too subtly, that Samuel settle his account before it grew any larger. The banker, Mr. Pembridge, made a special trip to discuss options that amounted to barely legal theft of the ranch. But it was the behavior of those he'd considered friends that cut deepest. Bob Garrett, who'd ridden with him on his first cattle drive, suddenly remembered a loan Samuel had given him years ago, money Samuel had told him to consider a gift. Times being what they are, Bob said, not meeting Samuel's eyes. I figured you'd be needing this back. He placed $50 on the table, a fraction of what Samuel had given him to save his own ranch. Sorry it can't be more, but I've got my own family to think of. Through it all, Margaret maintained a quiet dignity that both amazed and shamed Samuel. She dealt with the sneers and condescension with grace, never complaining even when Henrietta accidentally spilled tea on her last good dress, or when Fletcher helped himself to food meant for other meals. One evening, Samuel found her in the garden, pulling weeds with fierce determination. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and for a moment she looked so beautiful it took his breath away. You should let Tom do that, he said quietly. Tom has enough to do with the stock. She didn't look up. Besides, I like the feel of earth in my hands. It's honest, unlike everything else in our lives right now. Samuel thought but didn't say. The guilt was eating at him like acid. Every kindness she showed, every moment of steadfast loyalty, made him feel worse. Margaret, Did you know that Fletcher has been sending telegrams to land speculators in Chicago? She interrupted. Violet told me. Apparently, he's already negotiating a commission for brokering the sale of our ranch. Samuel's jaw tightened. Is that so? And Henrietta has her eye on more than the sideboard. I caught her in our bedroom yesterday, admiring my mother's pearl necklace. She sat back on her heels, finally looking at him. The vultures are circling. Samuel, let them circle, he said bitterly. Soon enough they'll realize there's nothing left to pick clean. She studied him for a long moment, those intelligent eyes searching his face. Is that really true? Are we truly ruined? The lie stuck in his throat. Looking at her there, dirt under her nails, her hair coming loose from its pins, wearing a patched dress because she'd given her better ones to the church charity box. He wanted to tell her everything, but he'd come too far to stop now. Yes, he said. We're ruined. She nodded slowly, then returned to her weeding. Then we'd best make sure this garden produces well. We'll need the vegetables. That night at dinner, with Fletcher holding court about his important connections and Henrietta making increasingly bold hints about items she'd like as keepsakes, Samuel noticed something different about Margaret. There was a set to her jaw, a straightness to her spine that spoke of determination. When Tom came to the door asking to speak with the boss, Fletcher immediately assumed he meant him. Yes, my good man. What is it? Tom looked confused. Begging your pardon, sir, but I need to speak with Mr. Hawthorne about the cattle. What about the cattle? Fletcher demanded. Some of them have wandered into the north pasture, near the property line with the Jeffers Ranch. Well, leave them. Soon enough they'll belong to someone else anyway. Fletcher waved dismissively. No. Margaret stood suddenly. Tom, saddle my mare. I'll help you move them back. Margaret, Henrietta gasped. Surely you're not going to do ranch work like a rancher's wife? Margaret finished. That's exactly what I am. Henrietta, Samuel, are you coming? He saw the challenge in her eyes and understood. She was showing these parasites what real strength looked like. I'll get my hat. As they rode out together under the stars, leaving their disgruntled guests behind, Samuel felt something ease in his chest. Margaret sat her horse like she was born to it, her divided skirt practical rather than fashionable, her hands sure on the reins. Remember when you taught me to ride? She asked softly. I was so scared of horses. You were terrified. He agreed. Took you a month to work up the courage to mount Buttercup, and she was the gentlest mare in Wyoming. You were patient with me, never laughed, never made me feel foolish. You were never foolish. Margaret, cautious, maybe, but never foolish. They found the cattle easily enough, a dozen head grazing peacefully in the moonlight, as they worked together to herd them back. Samuel was struck by how natural this felt. No pretense, no lies between them, just two people working side by side as they had in the early days of their marriage. Samuel, Margaret said as they headed home, whatever happens, I want you to know something. He tensed, waiting. I'm not afraid, she continued. Poverty doesn't frighten me. Loss of status means nothing. The only thing that would truly break me is losing you. The words hung between them in the cool night air, and Samuel felt the knife of guilt twist deeper. He'd wanted to test her mettle, to see what she was made of. Now, with each passing day, the answer became clearer, and it was he who was found wanting. Back at the house, they found Fletcher in Samuel's study, papers spread across the desk. He looked up guiltily as they entered, mud still on their boots. Just organizing some thoughts, he said quickly, gathering the papers. About your situation. Samuel saw his own letterhead among the documents. Lists in Fletcher's hand. Plans for dividing the ranch. No doubt, calculations of worth. His cousin was already counting his commissions. Get out of my study, Samuel said quietly. Now, Sam, no need for... Get out. Fletcher scurried away, and Margaret laid a gentle hand on Samuel's arm. Come to bed. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles. As they climbed the stairs, Samuel could hear Henrietta and Fletcher whispering in the parlor, no doubt planning their next moves. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a den of wolves. But in their bedroom, with Margaret curled against him, her trust absolute despite the dire circumstances he'd manufactured, Samuel found himself praying for the first time in years. Not for wealth or success, but for forgiveness and for the courage to end this charade before it destroyed the one pure thing in his life. The pretense of poverty began to take its toll on the Hawthorne Ranch like a slow-acting poison. Samuel had dismissed most of the ranch hands with carefully orchestrated explanations of inability to pay wages, keeping only young Tom Bradley and old Pete Sanchez, who'd been with him since the beginning. The remaining cattle grew thinner without proper care, their ribs beginning to show through dusty hides. The fences went unmended. The barn developed leaks that Samuel deliberately ignored, and weeds crept into Margaret's once pristine garden. Fletcher and Henrietta had finally departed after 2 weeks of freeloading, but not before Fletcher had borrowed Samuel's gold pocket watch as collateral for future assistance, and Henrietta had somehow packed several silver spoons in her luggage. Their absence brought little relief, as the real hardships of Samuel's manufactured poverty began to manifest. Margaret rose before dawn each day, her hands growing calloused from milking their remaining cows and gathering eggs from their dwindling flock of chickens. Samuel watched her work with growing admiration and deeper guilt. She never complained, even when the pump handle broke and she had to haul water from the well by bucket, or when she burned her arm on the old stove that Samuel had secretly damaged to make it harder to use. We should sell the chickens, she said one morning over a breakfast of cornmeal mush and preserved peaches, their last jar from better times. They're eating more than they're producing. Samuel pushed the tasteless meal around his bowl. Maybe you're right. No. She set down her spoon firmly. We keep the chickens. We need the eggs. But I'll let them forage more, reduce the feed. Her practical determination shamed him. While he played at poverty, she lived it with a grace that made his deception feel even more despicable. The worst came when Margaret took to mending other people's clothes for money. Mrs. Patterson from town, who'd once begged for invitations to Margaret's teas, now brought torn dresses and worn trousers, paying a pittance for repairs while making cutting remarks about how the mighty have fallen. I never thought I'd see a Hawthorne woman doing piecework, Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon, examining Margaret's neat stitches with a critical eye. Still, I suppose we all must eat. Margaret's smile never wavered. Honest work, Mrs. Patterson. Your dress will be ready Thursday. After the woman left, Samuel found Margaret crying silently over her sewing, tears dropping onto the fabric. It was the first time he'd seen her weep since this charade began. Margaret. He reached for her, but she pulled away. I'm fine, just tired. She wiped her eyes quickly. The light's poor for sewing. I'll need to buy spectacles soon, but... She trailed off, both of them knowing spectacles were a luxury they supposedly couldn't afford. That night, Samuel nearly confessed everything. The words crowded in his throat as they lay in their cold bed. He'd stopped ordering coal for the furnace, claiming they couldn't afford it. Margaret pressed against him for warmth. Her body thin from the reduced rations, she insisted they observe. "Samuel?" she whispered in the darkness. "Yes. Do you remember our wedding day? Every moment. You promised me we'd face everything together. Good times and bad. I remember. I'm keeping my promises too," she said softly. "No matter what." The next morning brought a new trial. Ed Jeffers, their neighbor to the north, arrived with a proposition. Jeffers had always resented Samuel's success, his own ranch struggling while the double bar prospered. Now he sat in their parlor like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. "I'll give you $500 for that north pasture," Jeffers said without preamble. "The one that borders my land." "That pasture's worth 10 times that," Samuel protested. Playing his role, "Was worth 10 times that," Jeffers corrected with a smirk. "But beggars can't be choosers. Hawthorne, take my offer or watch the bank take it for nothing." "We'll consider it," Margaret interjected before Samuel could respond. "Give us a week." After Jeffers left, Samuel paced the room like a caged wolf. $500, that's theft. "It's 500 more than nothing," Margaret said practically. "We could live on that for months if we're careful. You want me to let that vulture steal our land?" "I want us to survive," she shot back, then softened. "Samuel, pride is a luxury we can't afford anymore." Pride. If only she knew how much pride had cost them already. The community's treatment grew harsher as news of their desperation spread. At church, families who once vied for their attention now avoided them, sliding down pews rather than sit near the fallen Hawthorns. Reverend Mills still nodded politely, but even his sermons seemed pointed, full of references to the dangers of worldly success and the virtue of humility. It was after one such sermon that Thomas Whitman approached them. Whitman owned the largest mercantile in 3 counties and had the morals of a snake. His wife had died 2 years prior, and rumor said he was looking for a new one, someone younger, prettier, more manageable. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, tipping his expensive hat. "Might I have a word?" Samuel tensed, but Margaret touched his arm lightly. "Of course, Mr. Whitman. I hear you've been taking in sewing. Fine work, I'm told." His eyes traveled over her in a way that made Samuel's fists clench. "I might have steady work for you. Good pay. Of course. It would require you to come to my establishment. Daily." The implication was clear. Whitman wasn't interested in her sewing skills. "How generous," Margaret replied coolly. "But I prefer to work from home. My husband needs me here." Whitman's smile turned predatory. "Your husband may not be in a position to need anything much longer. When the bank forecloses, you'll need employment. My offer stands, and might expand to include other arrangements, comfortable arrangements for a woman of your qualities." "Mr. Whitman," Samuel growled, stepping forward, but Margaret held him back. "Thank you for your offer," she said with icy politeness. "But I'll continue as I am. Good day." Whitman shrugged. "Pride goeth before a fall, Mrs. Hawthorne, and you've already fallen quite far." That evening, Margaret was quieter than usual. She served their meager supper, thin soup and day-old bread bought cheap from the baker, with mechanical precision. "You should have let me hit him," Samuel muttered. "And have the sheriff arrest you? We can't afford bail." She sat across from him, her face drawn. "Besides, he's not the first to make such suggestions. Mrs. Wellington mentioned her brother in San Francisco needs a governess. Mrs. Morrison suggested I might find work in Denver, in one of the entertainment establishments." Samuel's spoon clattered to the table. "What?" "Oh, she was very delicate about it. Said many fallen women from good families found it preferable to starvation." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Apparently, my fall from grace makes me suitable for all manner of employment. Margaret, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The words escaped before he could stop them. She looked at him sharply. "For what? You didn't choose this. Bad investments happen?" Her faith in him, Her refusal to blame him even as their world crumbled, cut deeper than any accusation could have. Samuel pushed back from the table, unable to bear it. Outside, the September wind carried the scent of coming winter. Soon the snows would arrive, and with them, greater hardships. How far was he willing to carry this deception? How much would he let her suffer to salve his own suspicious heart? In the barn, he found Tom Bradley brushing down the horses. The young man looked up nervously as Samuel entered. Evening. Mr. Hawthorne. Tom. Samuel leaned against a stall door, watching the boy work. Tell me something. Why do you stay? I can barely pay you, and you could find better work elsewhere. Tom shrugged, focusing on the horse. My PA worked for you when I was small. You gave him an advance when my ma was sick. Never asked for it back even after she died. You gave me a chance when no one else would hire a green kid. I figure I owe you more than fair weather friendship. Even if it means going down with the ship? Ships can be rebuilt, Mr. Hawthorne, long as the captain's worth following. Samuel left the barn feeling worse than ever. Even the hired help showed more loyalty than his blood relatives. He'd wanted to test those around him, to separate wheat from chaff. Instead, he was discovering that the only chaff in his life might be his own suspicious heart. Back in the house, he found Margaret at her eternal sewing, working by the light of a single candle to save oil. Her face was pale with exhaustion. Her beautiful auburn hair had lost its luster, and her dress hung loose on her thinning frame. Yet, when she looked up at him, her smile was genuine. Almost finished with Mrs. Baker's curtains. She's paying extra for the rush. How much extra? 50 cents. 50 cents. His wife, who once hosted governors' wives and ordered gowns from Paris, was grateful for 50 cents. Margaret, stop. He crossed to her, taking the sewing from her hands. Just stop. Samuel, what's wrong? Everything, he wanted to say. I'm wrong. This whole damn charade is wrong. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he pulled her to her feet, holding her against him. Dance with me, he said impulsively. Dance, Samuel, there's no music. We don't need music. He began to hum tunelessly, swaying with her in the candlelight. She laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd heard from her in weeks, and followed his lead. They danced slowly around the parlor, avoiding furniture by memory, her head resting on his shoulder. Remember our first dance? She murmured. You stepped on my feet 3 times. You told me I danced like a bear. A very handsome bear. She pulled back to look at him. Samuel, whatever happens, I need you to know I've never regretted marrying you, not for a single moment. The words broke something inside him. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow he would end this charade, confess everything, and beg her forgiveness. He couldn't watch her suffer another day for his foolish doubts. But tonight, in their drafty house with its leaking roof and empty larder, he held his wife close and danced to music only they could hear, wondering if she would still want to dance with him once she knew the truth. The whispers followed Margaret through Cheyenne's dusty streets like tumbleweeds in a desert wind. 2 months into their supposed financial ruin, she had become the town's favorite subject of gossip and speculation. Women who once sought her friendship now crossed the street to avoid her, their silk skirts rustling with self-importance as they passed the formerly great Mrs. Hawthorne in her patched calico. There she goes. Samuel heard Mrs. Wellington murmur to her companion as Margaret entered Patterson's general store. From hosting the governor's ball to haggling over the price of flour, pride certainly does go before a fall. Samuel lingered outside, watching through the window as his wife carefully counted coins from her small purse. She was buying only the essentials: flour, salt, a small tin of baking powder. When Mr. Patterson suggested she might want to establish credit, his tone made it clear he expected her to beg. Thank you, but I prefer to pay as I go. Margaret replied with quiet dignity. My mother taught me never to buy what I couldn't afford. Your mother was a smart woman, Patterson said, though his smirk suggested otherwise. Of course, She never had to fall from such heights. Margaret's spine straightened, but she merely collected her purchases. Good day, Mr. Patterson. As she emerged from the store, Samuel fell into step beside her, taking the parcels from her arms. Let me carry those. I can manage, she protested. But he'd already shouldered the burden. They walked in silence for a moment before Margaret spoke. Mrs. Wellington offered me a position today. Samuel's jaw tightened. What kind of position? Companion to her mother-in-law. The woman is senile and difficult. The last 3 companions quit within a month. Margaret's laugh was humorless. She seemed to think I should be grateful for the opportunity to clean up after a woman who throws her chamber pot at anyone who displeases her. You're not taking it. We need the money. Samuel. No. The word came out harsher than intended. Not that, never that. Margaret stopped walking, turning to face him in the middle of the street. Then what? We've sold everything valuable. I've mended every torn garment in 3 counties. What else would you have me do? Before he could answer, a commotion erupted near the bank. A crowd had gathered, voices raised in excitement. Samuel recognized Ed Jeffers' distinctive bellow rising above the rest. Saw it myself. The whole eastern range of the Double Bar. Nothing but dead cattle. Dozens of them. Samuel's blood ran cold. This wasn't part of his deception. Stay here, he told Margaret, but she was already following him toward the crowd. What's this about dead cattle? Samuel demanded, pushing through to face Jeffers. The man's weathered face split into a grin that held no humor. Your eastern range, Hawthorne. Looks like you've got diseased stock, Texas fever. If I had to guess, probably spread to half your herd by now. That's impossible. My cattle are healthy. Were healthy. Jeffers corrected. Course, a man who can't afford proper help might not notice sickness spreading until it's too late. Samuel's mind raced. He'd pulled most of the hands from the eastern range as part of his charade, leaving the cattle largely untended. If disease had somehow gotten into the herd, I need to see for myself. He said, Better hurry, someone called out. Sheriff's already talking about quarantine. Can't have diseased cattle infecting the whole county. Samuel found Margaret's hand in his, her fingers cold despite the warm September afternoon. We need to get back to the ranch, he said quietly. They borrowed a wagon from the livery. Even that simple transaction fraught with humiliation as the stable master demanded payment in advance, clearly doubting Samuel's ability to pay. The ride home was silent, except for the creaking of wheels and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. The eastern range was a 40-minute ride from the main house. As they crested the final ridge, the smell hit them first, the sweet, cloying stench of death carried on the wind. Then they saw them, dark shapes dotting the grassland like scattered boulders. Oh, Samuel, Margaret breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. He counted at least 30 head down, their bodies bloated in the heat. Flies swarmed in black clouds, and turkey vultures circled overhead. These cattle had been dead for days, maybe a week. Stay in the wagon, he told Margaret, jumping down to investigate. But she was already beside him, covering her nose with her handkerchief as they approached the nearest carcass. Samuel knelt beside it, examining the animal with growing dread. The symptoms were clear blood from the nose and mouth, the telltale swelling. Texas fever, just as Jeffers had said. How did this happen? Margaret asked. Our cattle were healthy. Samuel knew how. In his eagerness to appear poor, he dismissed the hands who would have noticed the first sick animals, who would have isolated them before the disease could spread. His deception had cost these animals their lives. Mr. Hawthorne. They turned to see Tom Bradley riding hard toward them, young Pete Sanchez close behind. Both men looked grim. Thank God you're here, Tom said, sliding from his saddle. We just discovered them this morning. Pete rode to town to fetch you while I started counting. How many? Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. 43 so far, and there's more sick ones in the draw. We've moved them away from the healthy stock, but... Tom shook his head. It's bad, sir. Real bad. The quarantine, Margaret said suddenly. If the sheriff quarantines our ranch, we can't sell any cattle. We'll have no income at all. Samuel saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for him, for their survival. She still believed their poverty was real, still thought they teetered on the edge of complete ruin. And now, thanks to his neglect, they faced a genuine crisis. We need to act fast, he said. Tom, Pete, round up every healthy animal you can find. Move them to the western pastures, as far from here as possible. Margaret, we'll need to burn the carcasses before the sheriff arrives. Burn them? Pete looked skeptical. That's a lot of cattle. Hefe. Then we'd better get started. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the smoke from the burning carcasses rising like a black monument to Samuel's folly. Margaret worked alongside the men, her dress soon filthy with soot and sweat, never complaining even when the heat from the fires made her sway on her feet. As darkness fell, Sheriff Coleman arrived with a delegation from town, including Ed Jeffers and Thomas Whitman. They sat their horses at a safe distance, bandanas over their faces. Hawthorne, the sheriff called out. I'm putting your ranch under quarantine. No livestock leaves this property until the county inspector says otherwise. For how long? Samuel asked, though he knew the answer. Could be months, maybe longer. The sheriff's voice held a note of sympathy. I'm sorry, Sam, I know this is hard, given your circumstances. Whitman rode forward slightly. This changes things. Hawthorne, a ranch with diseased cattle isn't worth much. I'll give you $2,000 for the whole spread. Cash money. You and your wife could start fresh somewhere else. $2,000? Margaret stepped forward, her face streaked with soot. This ranch is worth $50,000, even with the quarantine. Was worth $50,000, Whitman corrected. Now, you'll be lucky if the bank doesn't foreclose before the quarantine lifts. Take my offer. It's more than you'll get otherwise. Get off my land, Samuel said quietly. Now, Sam, be reasonable. Jeffers began. Get off my land. The delegation retreated, but not before Whitman called back. The offer stands. Hawthorne, for now. As their dust settled, Margaret turned to Samuel. $2,000, she said quietly. That could give us a new start. Maybe in California, or... No. Samuel, be practical. With the quarantine, we can't sell cattle. We can't pay the bank. We'll lose everything anyway. He looked at her, standing there in her ruined dress, her face smudged with soot, her hands blistered from the work of burning the dead cattle. His beautiful, faithful wife, who still believed they were truly facing ruin, who was willing to give up everything and start over with nothing, as long as they were together. I can't, he said, the words thick in his throat. Can't or won't. For the first time since this began, anger flashed in her eyes. Samuel Hawthorne, I have stood by you through everything. I've endured the whispers, the insults, the loss of every comfort I once knew. I've watched you grow thinner and more haggard with each passing day. But I will not watch you throw away our last chance at a future because of pride. It's not pride? Then what is it? She was crying now, tears cutting channels through the soot on her cheeks. What is worth more than our survival? Tell me! He opened his mouth to confess everything, to finally end this horrible charade, but Tom's shout interrupted him. Fire! The barn's on fire! They turned to see flames licking at the eastern wall of the main barn. Whether a spark from their burning had drifted or something else had caused it, the result was the same. Their barn, filled with what little hay they'd managed to store, was ablaze, without thinking. Samuel and Margaret ran toward the inferno. Tom was already leading the horses out, Pete throwing buckets of water that might as well have been teaspoons against the growing flames. The feed store! Margaret shouted over the roar. If we lose the feed... She was already running into the barn before Samuel could stop her. He plunged after her into the smoke and heat, finding her trying to drag sacks of grain toward the door. Together they hauled what they could save, their lungs burning, sparks singing their clothes. By the time they emerged for the last time, coughing and gasping, the barn was fully engulfed. They could only stand and watch as it collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame, taking with it their winter feed supplies and what few tools remained. Margaret swayed on her feet, and Samuel caught her as she fell. Her hands were burned from handling the hot grain sacks, her hair singed, her breathing labored. "Why?" she whispered, looking up at him. "Why is this happening to us? Because I'm a fool," he thought. "Because I let suspicion and doubt poison everything good in my life." "I don't know," he said instead, holding her close as their barn burned to ashes. "I don't know." That night, as Margaret slept fitfully beside him, her burned hands wrapped in torn sheets, Samuel stared at the ceiling and faced the truth. His test had become real. His manufactured poverty had led to genuine catastrophe. The disease, the fire, the very real possibility of losing everything, all because he'd wanted to know if his wife truly loved him. Now he knew. She loved him enough to burn her hands saving grain they couldn't afford to lose. Loved him enough to face down the scorn of an entire town. Loved him enough to consider starting over with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And he loved her too much to let this continue another day. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would tell her everything and face whatever consequences came, even if she hated him for it, even if she left him. She deserved the truth. But as dawn broke gray and smoky over the Double Bar Ranch, Samuel would discover that tomorrow had its own plans, and that some truths, once set in motion, take on a life beyond anyone's control. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance that old-timers said they hadn't seen since the Great Freeze of '71. The first snow fell in late October, covering the charred remains of the barn and the graves of the diseased cattle like a merciful shroud. But mercy was in short supply at the Double Bar Ranch. Samuel stood at the frosted window, watching Margaret split firewood in the yard. Her breath came in white puffs as she swung the axe with grim determination. He'd tried to take over the chore, but she'd insisted on sharing the work. "4 hands make lighter labor than 2, she'd said, though they both knew it was her hands that bore the worst of it, still tender from the burns she'd sustained in the fire. The house had grown colder with each passing day. They'd moved into the kitchen entirely, sleeping on a makeshift bed near the stove to conserve what little firewood remained. The elegant parlor where they'd once entertained governors and cattle barons was shut off. Sheets thrown over furniture to protect it from the creeping frost. "You'll catch your death," Samuel said as Margaret came inside, her lips blue with cold. "Death will have to wait," she replied, warming her hands over the stove. "We need enough wood to last the week." The week. They were measuring their survival in weeks now, sometimes days. The quarantine remained in effect, their healthy cattle growing thinner on winter grass, without the barn. They had no shelter for the animals except a lean-to Tom and Pete had constructed from salvaged timber. Every morning brought new casualties, calves frozen in the night, cows too weak to survive the plummeting temperatures. "Tom says the Jeffers Ranch lost a dozen head last night," Margaret said, pouring hot water from the kettle. They'd run out of coffee weeks ago, making do with chicory root she'd dug from the garden before the ground froze. "The whole county's suffering, but none suffering like us," Samuel thought bitterly. Other ranchers had barns, had hay stored away, had money to buy feed. His deception had left them uniquely vulnerable to winter's assault. A knock at the door interrupted his dark thoughts. Margaret moved to answer it, but Samuel stopped her. These days, visitors rarely brought good news. Sheriff Coleman stood on the porch, his hat dusted with snow. Behind him, Samuel could see Thomas Whitman's carriage. "Sam," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "I'm here on official business." "The bank?" Samuel guessed. Coleman nodded, producing a folded document from his coat. "Foreclosure notice. You've got 30 days to pay the outstanding debt or vacate the property." Margaret appeared at Samuel's shoulder, reading the notice over his arm. The amount was staggering, or would have been, if it were real. In truth, Samuel could pay it 10 times over with the money he'd hidden away. But Margaret didn't know that. She saw only the death warrant for their life together. 30 days. she whispered. "In the middle of winter." Whitman emerged from his carriage, picking his way across the frozen yard with fastidious care. "Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Hawthorne, I thought I might renew my offer." "Still 2,000?" Samuel asked harshly. "Oh, no." Whitman's smile was predatory. "That was before the barn burned, before you lost another 40 head to the cold. Now, I'd say 1,500 is generous. More than generous. Considering." "Considering what?" Margaret's voice was steel. "Considering your limited options." His gaze lingered on Margaret in a way that made Samuel's fists clench. "Of course. Arrangements could be made. Separate arrangements. A woman of your qualities need not suffer simply because her husband made poor investments." The silence that followed was profound. Even the sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitman," Margaret said with quiet dignity, "I would sooner freeze to death in a snowbank than accept any arrangement from you. Good day." Whitman shrugged. 30 days. Then, we'll see how you feel when the sheriff comes to evict you." He turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Hawthorne? I heard your last 2 hands quit this morning. Something about not working for free anymore. You're truly alone now." After they left, Margaret sank into a chair by the stove. Samuel had rarely seen her look so defeated. "Tom and Pete are gone. I told them to go," Samuel admitted. "They have families to feed." "So do we," she said softly, placing a hand on her stomach in an unconscious gesture that made Samuel's heart stop. "Margaret?" She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "I wasn't certain. I thought perhaps it was just the lack of food, the strain, but I'm sure now. 3 months along, maybe 4. The room spun. A child. Margaret was carrying his child, and here they sat in a frozen kitchen with 30 days before eviction. No money, no food, no hope. His test had become a nightmare that now threatened not just them, but an innocent life. "Margaret, The confession was on his lips when another knock interrupted. This time it was young Billy Morrison from town, the doctor's son. "Mrs. Hawthorne, Pa sent me. Says to come quick. Your sister's taken ill with a fever." "She's asking for you." Margaret's face went white. Her sister Clara lived in Nebraska, a 3-day journey in good weather, in winter, with no money for train fare. "I can't go," she said numbly. "We can't afford—" "Doc says it's bad," Billy interrupted uncomfortably. "Says if you want to see her." He didn't need to finish. Margaret rose unsteadily, and Samuel caught her arm. "You'll go," he said firmly. "We'll find the money." "How?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Margaret's mother's pearl necklace, the one she'd hidden away despite their supposed poverty. She retrieved it from its hiding place with shaking hands. "Mother gave this to me on my wedding day," she said, running her fingers over the luminous pearls. "Said it would bring me luck in marriage." "Margaret, no. What choice do we have?" She thrust the necklace at him. "Take it to town. Sell it. It should bring enough for train fare and a bit extra." Samuel held the necklace, feeling the weight of her sacrifice. This wasn't just jewelry. It was her last connection to her mother, her final treasure. And she was willing to part with it to see her sister one last time. "I'll go with you," he said. "No." Her voice was firm. "Someone needs to tend what's left of the stock. I'll be fine." But as he helped her pack a small bag with their last decent clothes, Samuel wondered if anything would ever be fine again. The next morning, he drove her to town in their rickety wagon, the wheels creaking through fresh snow. At the train station, she turned to him with eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow in the world. "If I don't come back, don't say that. Listen to me." She gripped his hands tightly. "If something happens, if Clara's fever is catching, promise me you'll survive. Promise me you'll find a way." "Nothing's going to happen to you." She smiled sadly. "We can't know that. But Samuel, whatever happens, I need you to know I've never regretted loving you. Not once. Not even now." She kissed him then, There on the platform with the wind howling around them and curious townspeople staring. It felt like goodbye. Samuel watched the train disappear into the snowy distance, carrying away the only good thing left in his life. Then he returned to the empty ranch, to the cold house and dying cattle, to face the truth he'd been running from. That night, alone for the first time since their marriage, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his lawyer in Denver, instructing him to prepare the documents needed to restore his fortune. The second was to Margaret, confessing everything. He sealed the second letter and placed it on the mantel, then sat back to wait. She would return in a week, perhaps 2. She would read his confession and know him for the fraud he was. She would hate him, rightfully so. But at least she and their child would be provided for. He would deed the ranch to her, transfer his hidden accounts to her name. She could have the life she deserved, with or without him in it. The wind howled outside, driving snow against the windows like accusations. Somewhere in Nebraska, his wife sat vigil at her sister's bedside, unaware that their poverty was a lie, that their suffering had been orchestrated by the very man who'd sworn to protect her. Samuel fed the last of the wood into the stove and settled in to wait. But fate, as he was about to learn, had other plans. For while he sat alone with his guilt and his letters, a group of desperate men driven to extremity by the harsh winter were making their own plans. And the Double Bar Ranch, isolated and apparently defenseless with its owner's poverty well known, made for a tempting target. The first he knew of danger was the sound of horses in the yard. Too many horses for honest visitors at this hour. Samuel rose from his chair, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. As the night exploded with violence and gunfire, the reckoning he'd feared was coming, but not in the form he'd expected. And Margaret, 3 days away and tending her dying sister, would never know how drastically their world was about to change once again. The riders came like wolves in the night, 6 men driven to desperation by the brutal winter. Samuel recognized their leader even through the bandana covering his face. Jack Brennan, a former ranch hand who'd been fired from the Jeffers, spread for rustling. The others were strangers, hard men with harder eyes, the kind who drifted through the territories leaving trouble in their wake. "Well, well," Brennan called out, his breath misting in the frigid air. "The great Samuel Hawthorne, all alone in his mansion. Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Samuel stood in the doorway, rifle held steady. "Turn around and ride out, Brennan. There's nothing here for you." "Nothing?" Brennan laughed harshly. "Everyone knows you've been holding out. Hawthorne, a man doesn't go from rich to poor overnight without hiding something away. We're here to collect what you've been hoarding. You've been listening to too many stories. Look around. Does this look like the home of a wealthy man?" One of the other riders, a scarred man with dead eyes, spoke up. "Brennan, let's just shoot him and search the place. Easy, Cole." Brennan dismounted, keeping his pistol trained on Samuel. "We're going to be civilized about this. Mister, Hawthorne here is going to show us where he keeps his emergency funds. Nice and peaceful like." "There are no funds," Samuel said. Even as his mind raced, the hidden safe in his study contained enough cash to satisfy these men, but revealing it would expose his deception. "Take what you want from the house, but I'm telling you, there's no hidden money. See, that's where you're wrong." Brennan stepped closer. "A little bird told me you've been selling things quiet-like, that you've got cash squirreled away for when things get really bad. Well, things are really bad now, aren't they?" Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last warning. Jack, ride out." The gunfire erupted suddenly. Cole, impatient and cold, fired first. Samuel felt the bullet tear through his shoulder as he squeezed off his own shot, dropping Cole from his saddle. Then chaos horses rearing, men shouting. The night filled with muzzle flashes and gun smoke. Samuel retreated into the house, slamming the door and barring it. Blood soaked through his shirt, but he had no time to tend it. Windows shattered as the raiders fired into the house, showering him with glass. "Burn it," he heard Brennan shout. "Burn him out." Through the broken window, Samuel saw torches being lit. His house, Margaret's home was about to suffer the same fate as the barn. He reloaded with shaking hands, his shoulders screaming in agony. The first torch arced through the parlor window, landing on Margaret's abandoned sewing. The fabric caught immediately, flames spreading to the curtains she'd mended so carefully. Another torch flew through the kitchen window, then another. Samuel knew he had to get out or burn alive. He kicked open the back door, diving into the snow as bullets whined overhead. The cold shocked his system, but he forced himself to move, crawling toward the shelter of the woodshed. There he goes! Footsteps crunched through the snow behind him. Samuel turned, firing blind, trying to buy himself time. His ammunition was running low, and the house was now fully ablaze. Flames reaching toward the sky like accusatory fingers. That's when he saw Margaret. She stood at the edge of the yard, still in her traveling clothes, her face illuminated by the flames consuming their home. She must have returned early, must have seen the fire from the road and come running. Now she stood frozen, taking in the scene. The burning house, the armed men, her husband bleeding in the snow. "Margaret!" Samuel shouted. "Run!" But she was already moving, not away but toward him. Brennan turned at Samuel's shout, his gun swinging toward this new target. "No!" Samuel struggled to his feet, trying to put himself between Margaret and danger. The shot was impossibly loud. Margaret jerked, her hand flying to her chest. For a moment she stood suspended, her green eyes wide with surprise. Then she crumpled into the snow, red spreading across the white. Samuel's roar of anguish cut through the night. He charged Brennan, tackling him to the ground, his fists connecting with savage force. They rolled in the snow, fighting for the gun between them. Samuel's wound weakened him, but rage gave him strength. The gun fired between them. Brennan stiffened, then went limp. Samuel rolled away, gasping, and crawled to Margaret's side. She was still breathing, barely. Her eyes found his, trying to focus. "Samuel, don't talk. Save your strength." He pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. But there was so much blood. Too much. "Clara," she whispered. "She died. The fever took her yesterday. I came home, wanted to be with you." "Shh, don't. The baby," she breathed, her hand finding his. "I'm sorry about the baby." The remaining raiders had fled at Brennan's death, vanishing into the night like the cowards they were. Samuel was alone with his dying wife, their house blazing behind them. The truth of his deception dying on his lips. "I love you," he said, tears freezing on his face. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. The poverty. It was a lie. I have money. I know." The words were barely audible. Samuel's heart stopped. "What?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Found the Denver bank papers, months ago, when I was cleaning your study." She'd known. All this time, she'd known about his deception and had said nothing, had continued to play the part of the devoted wife facing poverty. "Why?" he asked, anguished. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because," she coughed, blood speckling her lips. "Because you needed to learn what I already knew. That love, real love, has nothing to do with money." Her grip on his hand was weakening. Samuel pulled her against him, cradling her in the snow as their world burned around them. "Don't leave me," he begged. "Please, Margaret. I'll make it right. Already forgiven," she whispered. "Always forgiven. But Samuel, promise me." "Anything. Live. Don't let guilt destroy you. Live and remember that I chose you, poor or rich. I chose you." Her eyes fluttered closed, and Samuel felt her last breath leave her body. He held her there in the snow, rocking back and forth as the house collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. That's how Sheriff Coleman found him at dawn, kneeling in the snow, Margaret's body in his arms, the ruins of the house still smoldering behind them. The sheriff had to pry him away, had to physically force him to let her go. The truth came out in the aftermath, as it always does. The bank papers Margaret had mentioned were found in the ruins, partially burned but legible enough. The town learned of Samuel's deception, his hidden wealth, his terrible test. Some were outraged. Others merely shook their heads at the folly of it all. But Samuel heard none of it. He was lost in grief so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. Margaret was buried in the town cemetery, next to her sister Clara, who'd been brought back for burial. The preacher spoke of forgiveness and redemption, but the words were ashes in Samuel's ears. Thomas Whitman, ever the opportunist, appeared at the funeral with papers. The ranch is still mine by rights. He said, the foreclosure. Samuel signed without reading, without caring. What was a ranch without Margaret? What was anything without her? But as the weeks passed and the sharpest edge of grief dulled to a constant ache, Samuel remembered her final words. Live, she'd said. Choose to live. He used his revealed wealth to rebuild, not for himself, but for others. The double bar became a refuge for widows and orphans, for those down on their luck. He hired back Tom and Pete, paid generous wages, shared his prosperity as he should have from the beginning. And sometimes, on cold winter nights, he would stand where the old house had been and remember dancing with Margaret by candlelight. He would remember her hands, burned from saving worthless grain, and her eyes, shining with love even as she knew of his deception. The child she'd carried was lost with her, taking with it the future they might have had. But Margaret's legacy lived on in the lives Samuel touched, in the generosity born from grief and guilt transformed into purpose. He never remarried. When asked why, he would simply say that he'd already had perfection, a woman who'd loved him not for his wealth or despite his poverty, but simply for himself. A woman who'd taught him, through her life and death, that the only test that mattered was whether love could survive truth. And it had. Even broken, even betrayed, love had survived. In her forgiveness, in her sacrifice, in her choice to protect him even as she knew of his deception, Margaret had proven that love, true love, was stronger than pride, stronger than doubt, stronger even than death. That was her gift to him. Her final lesson, that what we seek to test often ends up testing us, and that the price of doubt is always higher than the cost of faith. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the small cabin where Samuel had taken shelter after the fire. 3 days had passed since Margaret's death. 3 days of existing in a haze of grief and shock. Sheriff Coleman had insisted he stay in town, both for medical attention to his wounded shoulder and to sort out the legal matters surrounding the attack and its aftermath. But Samuel couldn't bear the pitying looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. So he'd retreated to this hunting cabin on the edge of his property, one of the few structures that remained standing. He sat at the rough wooden table, Margaret's last letter before him, the one she'd written from Nebraska telling him of Clara's death. Her handwriting, usually so neat, showed signs of exhaustion and sorrow. My dearest Samuel, Clara passed this morning. The fever was too strong, and she was too weak from the winter's hardships. I held her hand at the end, and she spoke of you, of how blessed I was to have found such a devoted husband, if she only knew the truth, that I am the blessed one. Samuel's hand trembled as he read on. I'm taking the evening train home. I know we have little money for such haste, but I cannot bear to be apart from you any longer. Whatever trials await us, we will face them together. Your devoted wife, Margaret P. And I felt the baby move today. Even in sorrow, life persists. A knock at the door interrupted his anguish. Samuel didn't answer, hoping whoever it was would leave, but the knock came again, more insistent. Sam, it's Doc Morrison. I need to check that shoulder. Reluctantly, Samuel let him in. The doctor was a thin, competent man who'd seen too much frontier violence to be shocked by anything. He examined Samuel's wound with professional detachment. You're lucky, Morrison said, rewrapping the bandage. Bullet went clean through, another inch to the right. He trailed off, then cleared his throat. Sam, there's something I need to tell you. About Margaret. Samuel's head snapped up. What about her? When I examined her, after... Morrison struggled with the words. Sam, she'd been hiding more than just knowledge of your financial situation. She was sick, consumption, in the early stages. She probably knew for months. The room spun. Samuel gripped the edge of the table. That's not possible. She never said anything, never showed signs. She was strong, stronger than most. And she was determined not to burden you, especially given what she believed were your financial troubles. Morrison's voice was gentle. I found laudanum in her traveling bag. For the pain, she must have been suffering terribly these last weeks. Samuel remembered her thinness, which he'd attributed to their reduced rations, her shortness of breath, which he'd blamed on the hard work, the way she'd sometimes press her hand to her chest when she thought he wasn't looking. She knew she was dying, he said hollowly. She knew, and she still stood by you, still worked herself to exhaustion trying to save the ranch, still protected you. Morrison packed his medical bag. That's the kind of woman she was. After the doctor left, Samuel found himself truly alone with the magnitude of what had happened. Margaret had known about his deception. She'd known about her own illness. She'd known about the baby that would never have survived her consumption. And through it all, she'd chosen to play her part in his terrible charade, allowing him to learn his lesson while she bore the cost in silence. He thought of her burning her hands to save grain, chopping wood with diseased lungs, facing down the scorn of the town while harboring his secret and her own. Every moment of suffering he'd witnessed had been doubled by what he hadn't seen. A rage built in him then, not at Margaret, never at her, but at himself. He overturned the table, sending the letter flying. He raged at the walls, at the sky visible through the window, at the God who would take such a woman while leaving him behind. When the fury finally spent itself, he collapsed on the floor, truly broken. That's where Tom Bradley found him hours later. Mr. Hawthorne? The young man entered cautiously. Sir, I'm sorry to intrude, but there are matters that need attending. Samuel didn't move. Let Whitman have it all. That's just it. Sir, Mr. Whitman's withdrawn his claim. The whole town knows the truth now. About your money. About what Mrs. Margaret knew. Whitman says he won't profit from a tragedy born of, well, he used stronger words, but he won't take the ranch. Then burn it all. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is that what she would want? The words cut through Samuel's self-pity like a blade. He saw Margaret's face, not twisted in death but alive with purpose, telling him to live, to remember. Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself upright. No, he admitted. No, it's not. Over the following days, as Samuel began to emerge from his grief-induced paralysis, the full story of Margaret's sacrifice came to light. Tom had found her journal, hidden in the root cellar that survived the fire. Her entries revealed everything. September 15th, found the bank statements. My heart broke, not from betrayal, but from understanding. Samuel doubts my love. How have I failed him so that he needs such proof? September 20th, the doctor confirmed my suspicions. Consumption, he says, perhaps a year if I'm careful. I cannot tell Samuel. Not while he conducts his test. He must learn what he needs to learn. October 3rd. The baby moves constantly now. I pray I can carry to term. Give Samuel this gift before, but the coughing grows worse. I hide it as best I can. October 15th. Samuel's relatives are vultures, circling what they think is a dying beast. How little they know him. How little he knows himself. But he is learning. Each day I see him discover what I always knew, that he is more than his wealth. November 1st. The fire took our barn, but not our spirit. Samuel saved the horses, risking his life for our animals. This is the man I married, the one hidden beneath doubt and suspicion. November 10th. I leave for Clara tomorrow. I fear I may not return, but I cannot let her die alone. Samuel, if you find this, know that every moment of hardship was worth it to see you become again the man you truly are. The final entry was dated the day she left, November 12th. The pain is very bad today. I've increased the laudanum dose, though I fear for the baby. But I must see Clara once more, and then home, to whatever time remains. I regret nothing except that I couldn't give Samuel the child he deserves. Perhaps it's better consumption often passes to infants. This way, only one heart breaks instead of two. Samuel read these words in the restored study of the ranch house, tears streaming down his face. Around him, workmen hired with his revealed wealth rebuilt what fire had destroyed. But no amount of money could rebuild what he'd lost. Fletcher arrived one afternoon as Samuel supervised the construction. His cousin looked older, deflated, his schemes having brought him nothing but shame. "I came to apologize," Fletcher said without preamble. "And to return this?" He held out Samuel's gold pocket watch. "I had no right to any of it." Samuel took the watch, its weight familiar in his palm. "We all played our parts. Fletcher, some better than others." "She was magnificent," Fletcher said quietly. "Margaret, the way she faced us all down, knowing what she knew. I'm ashamed of how I treated her. She forgave you. She forgave everyone." Samuel pocketed the watch. That was her way. As winter gave way to spring, Samuel threw himself into Margaret's vision for the ranch. He established a fund for widows, built a school for ranch children, set aside pastures for struggling homesteaders to graze their meager herds. The Double Bar became known not for its wealth, but for its generosity. One day in April, as wildflowers bloomed where the old house had stood, Sarah Patterson came to see him. The banker's wife who'd whispered about Margaret at the cattleman's ball stood in his doorway, wringing her hands. "Mr. Hawthorne, I've come to, that is, I wanted—" She stopped, then started again. "I was cruel to your wife. I said things, implied things that were untrue and unkind. I know it's too late for her forgiveness, but I needed you to know I'm sorry." "She heard worse from others," Samuel said, though not unkindly. "But thank you for saying so." Sarah turned to go, then looked back. "She came to see me, 2 weeks before the end. She brought me a shawl she'd made, said she'd noticed I'd been cold at church. After everything I'd said about her, she brought me a gift." Sarah's voice broke. "I wasn't worthy of her kindness." "None of us were," Samuel agreed. "But she gave it anyway." As the months passed, Samuel learned to live with his grief, to honor Margaret's memory through action rather than wallowing in guilt. He told their story honestly to anyone who asked, not sparing himself in the telling. Some judged him harshly, others with compassion, but all agreed that Margaret Hawthorne had been a woman unlike any other. The following Christmas, Samuel stood at Margaret's grave, the headstone now weathered by a year of seasons. Fresh flowers lay at its base, not just from him but from the many lives she'd touched. Tom Bradley's wife had left a small knitted cap, made for the baby that would have been. The schoolteacher left a note thanking Margaret for the books donated in her name. Even Thomas Whitman had left something, a single white rose and a card that read simply, "Forgive me, you did it," Samuel said to the stone, his breath misting in the cold air. "You saved us all, in the end, me most of all." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter he'd written confessing everything, the one Margaret had never needed to read. He'd carried it for a year, a reminder of his folly. Now he laid it on her grave and watched as the wind took it, scattering the pages across the prairie. "I'll live," he promised her. "I'll live and remember and try to be worthy of the love you showed me, both when I deserved it and when I didn't." As he walked back to the ranch house, rebuilt but forever changed, Samuel reflected on the hard truth Margaret had died teaching him. Love wasn't something to be tested or measured or doubted. It was something to be treasured, trusted, and returned in equal measure. He'd learned that lesson too late for Margaret, but not too late to honor her memory by living it every remaining day of his life. The great test he'd devised had indeed revealed the truth about those around him, but more importantly, it had revealed the truth about himself, and in her quiet strength, her steadfast devotion, and her ultimate sacrifice. Margaret had shown him that the only wealth that truly mattered was the love we give and receive, freely and without condition. 5 years had passed since that terrible winter night, The Double Bar Ranch stood transformed, not just in its physical structures, but in its very soul. Where once a single grand house had dominated the landscape, now a small community thrived. The main house, rebuilt with simple grace rather than ostentation, served as the center of what locals had come to call Margaret's Haven. Samuel stood on the porch of the community hall, watching children play in the yard where the original barn had burned. Their laughter carried on the spring breeze, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the sound of hammers from the new construction site. Another family was arriving today, the Kowalskis, Polish immigrants who'd lost everything in a fire in Chicago. Mr. Hawthorne, Mary Bradley, Tom's wife, appeared at his elbow. "The new family's wagon is coming up the road." Samuel nodded, straightening his simple work clothes. Gone were the fine suits and gold watch chains. In their place were practical garments suited to a man who worked alongside his hands, who knew each cow by name and each family's story by heart. The Kowalskis were typical of those who found refuge at the Double Bar, desperate, suspicious of charity, proud despite their circumstances. The father, Joseph, climbed down from the wagon first, his eyes wary as he took in the prosperous ranch. "Mr. Hawthorne, we were told, that is, they said in town you might have work." "We always have work for willing hands," Samuel replied, extending his own calloused hand in welcome. "Tom here will show you to your cottage. Take today to settle in. Tomorrow, we'll discuss what skills you bring and where you'd fit best." Joseph's wife, Anna, clutched their 3 children close, tears streaming down her face. "It's true. You give us house. We pay no rent until we can." "The cottage is yours as long as you need it," Samuel assured her. "The only payment required is that when you're back on your feet, you help another family in need. That's Margaret's rule." "Margaret?" Anna asked. "My late wife. This was her vision." As Tom led the family away, Samuel noticed a familiar carriage approaching. His chest tightened as he recognized the passenger, Violet Parsons, Henrietta's daughter. He hadn't seen her since those awful days when vultures had circled his supposed downfall. Violet had changed in 5 years. Gone was the simpering girl pushed forward by her ambitious mother. In her place stood a composed woman in modest traveling attire, her face marked by experiences Samuel could only guess at. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, stepping down without waiting for assistance. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. Your letter was persuasive, Miss Parsons. You said you had something of Margaret's?" Violet reached into her bag and withdrew a small leather journal. "Mother took this when we visited. She thought it might contain information about hidden assets." Violet's laugh was bitter. "She was always looking for angles. My mother, I found it in her things after she passed last year." Samuel accepted the journal with trembling hands. It was one of Margaret's earlier ones, from the first years of their marriage. "I read it," Violet admitted. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I needed to understand. Mother never did. You see, she never understood why Mrs. Hawthorne stayed with you during the difficult times. She thought your wife was either stupid or scheming, but reading her words..." Violet's voice caught. "She loved you, simply and truly loved you." "More than I deserved." "No," Violet said firmly, "exactly as much as you deserved. She saw who you really were, even when you'd forgotten yourself." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Violet continued, "I came to ask if you might have a position here. I have some skill with teaching, and I heard you run a school. I have nothing to offer but willingness to work. Mother's schemes left me with debts rather than fortune." "Can you start Monday?" Her relief was palpable. "You don't need references? Or to test my abilities?" Samuel smiled sadly. "I've learned the futility of tests. Miss Parsons, Monday will be soon enough to see what you can do." That evening, Samuel sat in his study reading Margaret's recovered journal by lamplight. Her words from years past seemed to speak directly to him. March 15th, 1883. "Samuel worries so about the future, about whether we have enough, whether we are enough. I wish I could make him see what I see, that we are already wealthy beyond measure, We have each other. We have this land. We have purpose. What more could anyone need? March 20th, 1883. The wildflowers are blooming early this year. I pressed some between these pages for posterity. Someday, I imagine, we'll look back and remember these as the golden days, before success complicated everything. Or perhaps success will only amplify what we already have. Time will tell. A pressed flower fell from between the pages, still holding a faint trace of color after all these years. Samuel held it up to the light, remembering Margaret picking flowers on their rides together, her hair shining in the sun. "Mr. Hawthorne?" Pete Sanchez knocked on the open door.
"Sorry to disturb, but there's someone here to see you."
"Says it's important." The visitor was a young woman Samuel didn't recognize, travel-worn and clearly pregnant. She stood in the parlor clutching a worn envelope. "Are you Samuel Hawthorne? The one who knew Margaret O'Brien before she married?" Samuel's heart skipped. "I'm her husband. Or was." The woman's face crumpled with relief. "Oh, thank God. I've been looking for months. My name is Rose Donnelly. I was Clara's friend, Margaret's sister. Clara died 5 years ago." "I know. I was with her near the end. She gave me this to deliver. But then Margaret died too, and I didn't know what to do. I've been carrying it ever since, trying to find the right person." She held out the envelope. "Clara said Margaret would want you to have it," with shaking hands. Samuel opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph he'd never seen. Margaret as a young girl, perhaps 16, standing with Clara in front of their childhood home. But it was the letter with it that stole his breath. Asterisk, "Dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I am gone. But I had to tell you one last thing. Remember when we were girls and dreamed of the men we'd marry? You always said you'd know him by how he treated those who could do nothing for him. You said kindness to the powerless was the true measure of a man. I met your Samuel once, years ago, before you were married. He didn't know who I was. I was traveling through Cheyenne, and my horse went lame. He stopped to help, spent hours finding me assistance, and refused any payment. When I tried to insist, he said, 'Helping folks is what we do out here.' I never told you because I wanted you to discover his character yourself. But know this, you chose well, sister. Whatever trials come, remember that the measure of a man isn't in his wealth or poverty, but in his heart, and your Samuel has a good heart. All my love. Clara." Asterisk, Samuel sank into a chair, overcome. Even from beyond death, the sisters were teaching him, showing him truths he'd been too proud to see. Rose shifted uncomfortably. "I should go. I just wanted to deliver—" "Stay," Samuel said suddenly. "Please. You're pregnant and tired. We have room. I couldn't impose. I have no money, no way to pay. Margaret would never forgive me if I turned away her sister's friend." He stood. Decision made. "Welcome to Margaret's Haven, Miss Donnelly. You're home now." As the months passed, the ranch continued to grow. The school expanded, the cottages multiplied, and families arrived from every corner of the country. Samuel oversaw it all with quiet efficiency, but it was Margaret's spirit that truly ran the place. Her portrait hung in the community hall, and newcomers often asked about the woman with the kind eyes and gentle smile. "She was our angel," old Pete would tell them. "Saw the best in everyone, even when they couldn't see it themselves." The harvest celebration that year was the largest yet. Tables groaned under the weight of food grown and prepared by the community. Children performed a play written by Violet, who had become a beloved teacher. The Kowalskis played Polish folk songs on instruments they'd crafted during the winter evenings. As the sun set over the celebration, Tom Bradley raised a toast to Margaret Hawthorne, who taught us that wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the lives we touch. "To Margaret," the crowd echoed, raising glasses of apple cider pressed from the ranch's young orchard. Samuel stood apart slightly, watching the joy Margaret had made possible in trying to test her love. He'd discovered its true depths. In losing her, he'd found her everywhere, in each act of kindness. Each family helped, each child educated. "You did it, my love," he whispered to the evening sky. "You took my bitter test and transformed it into something beautiful. You saved not just me, but all of us." As if in answer, a warm breeze swept across the gathering, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the sound of laughter. And for just a moment, Samuel could swear he felt her presence, as real as the day they'd first danced in this very spot. The Double Bar Ranch would continue for generations, becoming legendary not for its cattle or wealth, but for the love story at its heart. Visitors would come from far and wide to hear how a rich rancher pretended to be poor to test his family. But what his wife did made them all cry, not just tears of sorrow, but tears of recognition. For in Margaret's sacrifice, in her quiet strength and boundless love, they saw the best of what humanity could be. And Samuel Hawthorne, once the richest man in the county, spent his remaining years as something far more valuable, a living testament to the transforming power of unconditional love. He never remarried, never stopped missing Margaret, but he honored her memory in the only way that mattered, by living the truth she died teaching him. That love, real love, asks for no tests and needs no proof. It simply gives, forgives, and transforms everything it touches into gold. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the American Wild West. I hope Margaret's tale touched your heart as deeply as it touched mine. Please share in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to connect with you all. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more powerful stories of love, sacrifice, and redemption from the frontier. And please, share your thoughts below. What did Margaret's sacrifice mean to you?